Hey everyone, and welcome to our very first episode about making an enemy. If you're just jumping into the series, all of the enemy aspects are going to work without any previous videos. We do need to have the StateChart add-on for our state system, so I'm going to put a link to that in the description. If you don't have it, you can add it in the asset library. So the first thing that we need to do is create a base enemy script. There are going to be a lot of things when creating an enemy that you don't want to have to do every single time you make a new enemy. This is an instance of inheritance. It's going to help make things a little bit cleaner. So let's go ahead and add that script. We're going to go to our assets folder and then to our scripts folder, and we get to create a new folder. So we're going to create one for enemies. And then let's create our base enemy script. I'm going to name this something a little bit weird, but I promise you there's a reason for it. So I'm going to name this Genesis enemy. Genesis is a starter kit add-on that I've been working on in addition to my game. It's sort of been developed as part of the game itself, sort of like prefabricated systems. So if you see Genesis pop up every now and then, that's because it's coming from that. I'll talk more about that in another video, but for now, that's what that means. So we're going to name that Genesis enemy, and let's open that up. So the first thing we need to do is set our class name. Now, for the most part, you're probably going to use a character body 3D for an enemy. You could use a rigid body 3D or some other variation. Maybe you're working in a 2D game. We're going to be working in character body. And that's partially because we're going to be using the navigation regions. Once we have that, we're going to add an export variable, and this is going to be part of the enemy system that we're talking about. This is something called enemy groups. An enemy group is just a way to organize a group of enemies within your level. You could have, say, enemies within a specific room. You could have different types of enemies. You could group them that way. This is a way to access them. So if I had 5 enemies within a level and I name them, enemy 1, enemy 2, enemy 3, I can access each of those individually, or I can also put them into room 1 as an enemy group, and then I can access all of them. This is a good way to send commands to those enemies in an organized way. We're going to do that in this video by triggering them. So that's our groups, and then we're going to do a ready function to use those groups and add them to an actual Godot group. If you don't know about that, if you go to a different mesh or something like that, you're going to have, in addition to signals in this tab here, you have groups. And these groups, like we've done for our player, are global or scene-based groups. You're going to call on these groups. It's a great way to communicate with things. So that's the first thing we're going to do. So for any group that we have within enemy groups, we're going to add it to that group. You don't even have to create them over here. It's just going to do it automatically if they don't already exist. And then finally, we're going to add a onTriggered function. This is just something we're going to override in our child classes. And we're going to eventually be adding more stuff to this base class, especially stuff that is going to happen across different enemies. There's no reason to copy that logic in a bunch of different places. So one of those is going to be our onTriggered function. Now that we have that, let's create our first enemy scene. We're going to create a new scene up here. We'll make this an other node, and we'll make it a character body 3D because that's what we are extending. And let's call this a simple enemy because it is going to be very simple. For this, let's add our mesh. I guess we'll do a capsule because that's kind of tradition. Actually, no, let's do a box. Everybody does a capsule. Let's do a box. I wouldn't suggest doing a box for a character, but let's just do a box, something different. I like to pop that up so the origin is right at the bottom, which now this is an enemy, so let's make it look a little bit menacing. Let's do a collision shape from this. We're not going to copy the box because a box is not a good collision shape for a character. We should use a capsule or a sphere, and then we'll bounce that up so it fits 0.9. There we go. Okay, we got our mesh and we have our collision. Now we're going to add our health component. So if you didn't do that video, that's okay. Basically, this is a component that allows us to give health to anything and allows us to damage anything. We're going to add that. It's important to add it as an immediate child of our root. And then let's set a health of 50. Let's do that. All right, next we're going to add what is called a navigation agent 3D. And this is going to make more sense once we add a navigation region. You're going to get all these lovely warning signs. Don't worry about that. Everything does work. It's just they might be adjusting this in the future to something that is drastic enough of a change, just to make note of it. So we're going to add a navigation agent. So what this does is it allows this enemy to navigate along a nav mesh. We're going to be creating the nav mesh in a little bit, but for right now, we're going to add this. We're going to do a couple of settings that will make sense once we handle the nav mesh. The first is pathfinding. So this is basically a pathfinding node. It allows us to use the A-star algorithm to find the shortest path from point A to point B. And point B in this case is going to be the player, and point A is where the enemy is. So we have some settings that we can adjust, including the desired distance for our path. I'm going to set this to 0.5 for now, 0.5 meters. And then target distance can stay at 1. And we're going to talk about this later, but I'm going to check the avoidance enabled. Again, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Next, we need to add a state chart. We did this for our player. Again, this is the StateChart add-on. If you don't have that, you can grab it in the description in the asset library. This is going to handle our states. It's a really excellent add-on. I love it. Great to use. We need to add that. And then let's run through the setup for this so we can have two different states. We're going to have idle, and we're going to have a following state. We're going to start in the idle state, and then we're going to trigger our following state, and that is when the enemy is going to be chasing us. So within our state chart, we need to add a root state, which is going to be a compound state. We'll name that root. We need to add two atomic states. The first will be our idle state, which will be the initial state for our compound state. And then we also need to add our follow state. Along with any atomic states that we have, we need to have a way to transition to those states. As far as I know, you can add these kind of anywhere that you want. You can add them directly underneath. It kind of goes wherever you are actually transitioning into. So I'm going to put them in the root, and then we'll have a transition. This is going to be a to idle transition. And when we set up a transition, we need to let it know where we want to actually transition to. And then we need a name for an event. That's how you spell that. We'll add the same one for our to follow. That will go to our follow state. And the event is to follow. Okay, we've got our health component, we've got our NavAgent 3D, and we've got our states set up. Let's create our subclass script for our enemy. So we're going to pick our Genesis enemy, and then we're going to extend the script. Let's save that in assets. Scripts, enemies, and call it simple enemy. Create that. And I didn't mean to add all of the extra character bodied 3D stuff, so we can delete all of that. All right, so we are going to add a class name for this, and then we are extending Genesis enemy. Again, that means everything that is in this script is also in the script, just by default. Now we can overwrite those things or extend those things. The first thing that we're going to add that is unique to this is a follow speed. So that's just the speed of the enemy. And then we need to grab a few of our nodes. We need to grab the NavAgent, the state chart, and the health component. You can use exports for this or just use an onReady. Either one's fine. And finally, we need to create a variable for our target. That is going to be whatever the enemy is going to attack, going to follow, going to pay attention to. In theory, that could be another enemy, but in this case, it's just going to be the player. All right, so let's add our ready function, and we'll talk about a couple of things in here. First, don't pay attention to the errors. We haven't added these callables yet. But let's take a note of what this is. So we have a ready function, which actually overwrites what we have in here. Whenever you add a function in a extended script, it overwrites whatever you're extending from, unless you use super. Super means we're going to take whatever's already in here first. We're actually going to run that, and then we run our extended version of the function. Really useful thing right there. After that, we're going to set our targets. If you remember, we have set the player to be in the player group. Just a quick and easy way to get the player from anywhere. And then we need to connect some signals from our health component, which is our died signal. And then we're going to connect another signal that we'll talk about in a minute the velocity computed, and that is coming from our NavAgent. Don't worry about that for now. We're going to talk about it very soon. Let's take a look at the physics process. Nothing complicated here. Pretty generic physics process here. We're just applying gravity. This can be whatever value you want. And then we're moving and sliding for our character body. All right, now if you remember within the base script, we had an onTriggered function, which didn't have anything in it, but we can overwrite that. So let's add our own onTriggered function for this simple enemy. And in this case, whenever we trigger, we want to go to our StateChart and send the event to follow, and that's going to make us go to our follow state. Let's also clear up one of these errors up here, and we need an onDied function. So let's do onDied, and if we die, then let's just get rid of it. And then finally, let's add our onVelocity computed. That's going to fix the error. I'm not going to talk about it just yet. We're going to work on our NavMesh first, but this is how we're setting our velocity. It has to do with the avoidance setting that we enabled, but we'll get into that. Let's save this scene finally and go to scenes. Let's create an enemies folder and we'll call it simple enemy. Save that. Now within the player script, we had all of our states and I created individual nodes to handle all of that logic. I did that because the player is pretty complicated when it comes to a state. The enemy, not so much. And honestly, you could just do this all in one script. And that's kind of what we're going to do anyway. So instead of using those individual nodes, we're just going to call these signals within the main enemy script. So all we really need to worry about is the follow state. So the fun part of creating enemies is you have to think about their behavior, their logic. Right now, when we're in idle, the enemy is just sitting there. Nothing is going to happen. So what we would want is when we trigger the enemy, we go to the follow state. And the follow state is going to be, I know where the player is, I'm going to go to that player. Now, obviously that doesn't have to be your logic, and we'll get into other types of enemy behaviors in the future videos. But right now it's very basic. I see the player, I go after the player. So what we'll do is we'll go to our follow state and then go into our signals tab. And we have all of our state entered, exited, physics processing, and processing. We want to take the state physics processing signal and we're going to connect it into our simple enemy script. Now the receiver method, you could name that however you want. I think I've got a little bit of a double there. So on follow state physics processing. At least it's pretty clear what that means. So we'll connect that. That's going to create a function. There it is in our script. And now we can add logic to that that will only run when we're in the follow state. Now I say that, but we're going to wait a minute. First, we're going to add our NavMesh. Let's save our enemy and we're going to go to our actual level here. So when we did our enemy, we added a navigation agent. That agent operates with a navigation region node. Now there's a specific way that you have to set that up. So let's look at that because you actually have to bake this thing. And let's go into our scene tree. We're going to add a new navigation region, add a child node, and we're going to add our navigation region 3D. We'll create that. And sometimes it's helpful to just kind of move that to the top. Before we do anything, we need to go to the inspector and then the navigation mesh right here. We need to create a new one. So we create a new, you can save that. You could of course save that resource. You have a ton of different options that honestly, right now, don't matter to us. There's a lot of detail here that I don't need to get into in order to get this to work. What you can do is look at the agent area down here. So we have settings for height, radius. These will typically match whatever your agents are for your enemies. This is just an understanding of like what the size of the enemies are. So for our heights, we're roughly 2. For radius, that 0.5 is fine. You have a max climb height, you have a max slope. It just helps enemies know what they can and can't do, where they can and can't go. Now, like I said before, you have to bake the navigation mesh. And if I click that, that button's up here. If I click that, nothing is going to happen. And that's partially because we don't have any source geometry to look at. What we need to do is go to the source geometry node option right here. And we need to go to group with children. Typically what you would do is you would make whatever your geometry is a child of the navigation region. And then if you bake it, it all shows up. Now, if you don't want that to be a child, what you can do is use the group with children option, get rid of that, and we can put whatever is holding your geometry information, your mesh instances, your static colliders, whatever is holding that, you can put that into a group. In fact, let's just call this like geometry, okay? And we'll make it a global group. Now, if we go to our navigation region and do group with children and call this geometry, it's gonna look for this group within this scene tree. Now, if we bake mesh, everything's gonna pop up. You can also determine whether you want to just use a mesh instances or if you wanna use both. You're gonna know which one you wanna use based on, if you see any weird spots within your level. Now, as we look at this, you'll notice we have all of these polygons set up now on our floor, throughout our level, on our slope. These polygons represent areas that the navigation agents can go. We can save that and let's add our simple enemy to our scene. Just drop that in there. Perfect. Let's run this and test it just to make sure we're not falling through the floor or something. We are not. In fact, we should be able to shoot them. Yeah, there you go. We just killed them. Perfect. Our health component is working. So let's implement the follow state. Let's go back to our script and remember the on follow state physics processing function that only runs while we're in the follow state. That's what we're going to work on. So I'm going to paste what I have in here and then we'll kind of work through what each of these mean. The first thing we're going to do in our follow state is check whether or not we actually have a target. If we don't have a target, then we don't need to do anything because we can't follow anything. Now within our navigation agent, which is handling the logic for where we want to go, we can set our target position for that nav agent. And we'll do that by setting it to the target's global position. So this is just saying that the place that we want to go is the global position of our target. Now when the nav agent reaches that target, it's gonna pass a signal and turn this is navigation finished to true. If that happens, then we wanna set our velocity of our nav agent back to 0. We just wanna make it stop and then we'll return. If that's not the case and we need to keep going, we need to get the next position in our path. So the nav agent works with a pathfinding algorithm, and that algorithm creates a bunch of different target spots along a path. And when we test this, I'm going to be able to enable the debug and you're going to see those points. We want to set the next position to the next path position from our nav agent and then get the direction to that next position. You get that by subtracting the global position of your enemy from that next position and then normalizing it. We set our velocity much like we set the velocity in a player controller. We get the direction and we multiply it by our speed. And then I've added a rotation here just so the enemy faces whatever direction they're moving. Otherwise, it kind of looks like it's a little weird. And that's all this is right here. That's our follow state function here. So let's just add a simple trigger system within our enemy. You could do this a number of different ways. You could have it so there's a spot within the level that, triggers once you move out of a doorway, the enemy's going to trigger. You can have a door trigger the enemy. For this example, we're just going to add an area 3D collision to the enemy, sort of like a sphere. So we'll go back to our enemy. We're going to add a child node. This is going to be an area 3D. And within that, we're going to name this our detection area. And within this, we're going to create a collision shape. Zoom out a little bit, and we're going to make this a sphere. That's a very tiny sphere, so let's make that radius like 10, which is maybe a little big. Let's go 5, nice and small. All right, we need to configure this so that it actually will detect the player. So go to our detection area 3D, go to your collision settings. It doesn't matter what layer it's on, that's not needed here. We just need a mask, and we don't need to mask the environment. We need to mask our player, and the player is in our layer 2. And we also don't need to detect any other areas, so we can turn this off as well, or you can leave it. It's not a big deal. All right, we got that set up, and now we need to connect our signal so we know when the player enters. So we go to our signals tab, we're going to do our body entered signal, and then within the simple enemy, we'll add that to it. And then when we enter, we're going to check if that body is in the group player. So if it's the player, and if it is, we're going to run on triggered. So whenever the player enters our detection sphere, we're going to trigger the enemy, and the enemy should follow the player according to our navigation settings. All right, so let's test this. I think I actually need to move this a little bit further away. I'm going to trigger it immediately. Let's move that over there. Let's run this. All right, there's our enemy. We should trigger it. There we go. We're getting some stuttering. All right, I think I know the issue. All right, so my path desired distance was a little bit too small. That was my mistake. So this is a much better setting. We'll set that to 1. Target desired to 1.1. Target desired should be a little bit higher than your path desired. All right, now let's test that. All right, so we have our enemy. We trigger the enemy follows. Now you can see the line there. That's the algorithm figuring out the best path. Go to our navigation agent, and we can make the pixel size even bigger. Let's do 8, custom path color. Let's see that. There we go. All right, so we can see our line now, and those little dots are the points, the targets along that path. And we can even go up our ramp. Now we have some edge cases. This is where those NavMesh settings will come in handy. So we have our enemy following, and we can shoot it and get rid of it. Now, the avoidance setting that we turned on, if you don't have avoidance turned on, you're just gonna wanna get rid of this in here. You don't wanna do the NavAgent velocity. Just set the velocity, and then your player is gonna follow like it needs to. I'm gonna keep avoidance off, and I'm gonna add a bunch of enemies to our scene here. All of these enemies are gonna trigger. So if we have a bunch of enemies and they're all being triggered and following the player, you're gonna notice how they all bunch up like that. And if they had collision with one another, they would just run into one another and stop. So that's what avoidance can fix. If we turn on avoidance and make sure our script uses NavAgent, now they'll try to avoid one another, and we can even adjust how much they avoid. So if we go into avoidance and change our radius, let's make it something much larger, make it 2 meters. You'll notice how much further spread out all of our enemies are. That's because they're calculating their pathfinding while keeping in mind they want to keep 2 meters away from any other enemy. Now you don't have to do 2 meters because that's pretty big, but you can do 1 meter, and now your group size is a little bit more realistic. We can even shoot them. We got some combat. And that is our very first enemy. We've got automatic movement. We've got different states. We've got pathfinding, that they're following the player. They're interacting with other enemies. We've even got health and death. So lots of polish, obviously, that can be done to this. I feel that's a pretty good start for our enemies. We're going to keep working on that and adding different behaviors. We don't want the enemy just to follow the player. We want the enemy to try to damage the player. So we're going to keep working on that in the next video. And as always, you can get the source files for this and any other video within the FPS series. You can get the project exactly as I have it on my Patreon. I'm also going to be putting a bunch of other stuff on there as well for shaders and different tutorials. So definitely check that out. Thank you for the support. And as always, keep creating.